Last time we were taking a look at Michelangelo's later style and the rise of the late Renaissance, or often known as the Mannerist style. And I want to examine some more of that influence, specifically focusing on Rome. And for the moment, I want to take a look at St. Peter's Basilica. We've been taking a look at how this has been an ongoing problem for the Catholic Church with the symbol of their authority beginning to crumble at the time of the Reformation, when it's being questioned in Germany and Switzerland and England and throughout Northern Europe. I want to take a look at some of the designs that have happened and how this was a transformative style, and eventually Michelangelo is going to take it over and going to solidify the style that we see today. Initially, when this was created, we have the Pope went to Bramante, who was an architect and rival of Michelangelo, and this is his initial design. The term basilica is an honorary title that can only be given by the Pope, and it designates something very important. So St. Peter's Basilica, rather than a cathedral, this is something that is extremely important. The importance here is this is where Peter was killed and buried. And so when Peter was put to death by Emperor Nero, they buried him, and then the Catholic Church later comes in and puts a church on the very site. And so as a way to symbolically indicate that the church is built on the keys of the kingdom that Christ gave Peter, they put the church on there to kind of hone in that idea a little bit further. Countless Christians were also killed on this site, however, and this is going to be important for some of those kind of subtle changes that they're going to add to Michelangelo's later style. St. Peter was condemned to be crucified, but he requested to be crucified upside down to distinguish him from Christ's death, and he was buried in a nearby tomb. And then early Christian saints took his remains and buried them in a nearby graveyard with a small monument, and so that's where they were able to know where he was buried. The original basilica that was built around 315 A.D. by Emperor Constantine, who was considered the first, I'm going to use some air quotes here, Christian emperor. He converted when he saw a heavenly sign that said, "Under this sign you shall conquer," and that was the cross that was given to him. So he put the cross on the shields, and then he was able to conquer, and then he made the Roman emperor, the empire, a Christian nation, right? And so later Christians knew where St. Peter's buried, and they were then taken to this basilica. By 1500, the church had fallen into ruin because the church moved to France, and then as they were moving back to Italy to get kind of back to the roots, a lot of the church had fallen into disrepair. Pope Julius II made a controversial decision to demolish the entire basilica and build a new one, so get rid of the old one and build a new one. He wanted a church large enough to house the tomb where he was having Michelangelo create for him, and so he wanted his tomb within it, so something that had to be large enough to have it. And he tasked Bramante with the idea of tearing down the original basilica, preserving its artifacts, and designing the new basilica. He told Bramante, quote, "Make me the most magnificent, biggest church in all of Christendom." And Bramante used the Greek cross seen here with its square to demonstrate the Renaissance principles. And so the Greek cross means that the vertical and the horizontal intersections are the same size, right? And it's going to be important because later artists are going to change that. But again, the focus here is on the ancient principles, and it's on the idea of perfect circles and perfect squares. And so notice how Bramante's design is a perfect square, and then you have the circles, incorporating that to kind of bring back those classical ideas to suggest that this is an important part of harmony, important part of the world, the earthly world, and the celestial coming together, right? And so he wanted to combine the design of the Pantheon and St. Peter's to combine the ancient world and Christianity to find harmony within them. He only completed 2 large arches before he died, and then it was later found out that Bramante's design really didn't work. He wanted a dome, but it could not be supported by the columns that he built. They just weren't large enough to support a dome. So when he dies, they commissioned the main artist in Rome at the time, Raphael. But Raphael really wasn't an architect. He was mainly a painter. And what he did when he took over the design is he changed it. And again, Raphael is mainly about preserving Christian traditions and Christian principles. And so he wants to go back to the original design of the Latin cross. And with the Latin cross, the vertical line is longer than the horizontal line. And so that's going to be another kind of point of contention as we go through several phases of St. Peter's development, right? Raphael had no experience, and so notice how this is much more bulky and unhandsome than Bramante's design, right? So he just kind of seems a little bit cluttered to some extent. However, Raphael dies in 1520, only 6 years after he made the commission or received the commission. And so he died before many of his plans were implemented. And then the project was put on hold until a little bit later when Baldassare Peruzzi took over after Raphael and reverted back to the Greek cross. But however, as he was trying to implement his designs, Rome was sacked. We talked about this before in 1527, and Clement VII, the Pope at the time, his hands were full and he couldn't really focus on completing the Basilica, and so it kind of was just put on a shelf and not really completed. And then when they came back to it, plans resumed in 1538 and 1539. Antonio di San Gallo was that submitted some designs, and so he reverts back to the Latin cross. But this was so big that there'd be very little light, and so he modified Bramante's design by adding an east side in the facade. But he makes the walls thicker in order to compensate for the heavy dome. But in so doing, it makes it so there's very little light, and it becomes problematic. He works on this for 8 years until he dies, and then this was what the facade would look like. It looks a little bit more kind of neo-Gothic. It does have the dome to it. It's much more ornate than the simplicity of the Renaissance. But notice how there's very little windows. I mean, there are windows, but the windows are so small that there's not going to be a lot of light to come in, and so it's just too busy. Too little light, and Michelangelo complained. And this is what he said when Michelangelo took over the design. He wanted to kind of rip down what San Gallo had built, but the Pope was a little bit leery about that. He's like, you know what, we've been trying this for several decades. Can we just kind of work with what we got? And Michelangelo's like, no, we need to start fresh because this is completely horrific. And this is what Michelangelo wrote to the then Pope, Pope Paul III. San Gallo immediately took away all the light from Bramante's plan, right? So that Bramante was kind of the original one that was building this. It has no light whatsoever. There are so many hiding places above and below, all dark, that they provide a great deal of opportunities for no end of vile misdemeanors, such as the concealment of outlaws, the counterfeiting of money, getting nuns pregnant, and other sordid misbehavior. So you can see that he's kind of painting a picture in the mind of the Pope, but it was so dark that he's suggesting that any criminal activity could happen within its walls and no one would really know. So in the evening, after the church closes, you'll need 25 men to seek out those who are hidden there. And so his argument is this is not going to work at all. This is not going to provide the light that we need. And so this is Michelangelo's new floor plan that he submits. And this is the floor plan that, for the most part, is where St. Peter's Basilica is today, right? So San Gallo dies in 1546, and Pope III employs an aging Michelangelo. Michelangelo was 71 at the time, right? So the reason why so many of these architects kind of come and go is because the average life expectancy wasn't very long, right? 40, 50 years old was extremely old. And so Michelangelo lives to 85, and so he's extremely old, but he's still working up until his death. And so at 71, he's a legendary artist, and so they gave him the commission. It was found in his writings that he didn't accept a commission. He did this without pay, and this is what he wrote. He says, "I undertake this only for the love of God and the honor of the apostle," close quote. And so he suggests that he did this just for the glory of being able to do it. And so some question whether that's actually true or not, but it's an interesting kind of story that he would undertake something so immense that would take him quite a few years to complete. When he was so interested in getting paid for his commission for Pope Julius II's tomb, that he would do it without pay. But regardless, right, Michelangelo undertakes this because of the pride of being able to complete something that's going to be kind of the brass ring for the Catholic Church, right, kind of the center hub of the Catholic Church. And so what Michelangelo does, he largely undoes what Sangallo does, and he begins again. And so let's just take a look at some of the floor plans. Bramante's design versus Michelangelo's floor plan. Notice that they're very similar in their design, right? So he returns back to that Greek cross. But what he does is he reinforces the walls to make them thicker so that they can uphold the heavy dome that's going to be above. But also he allows for that open concept, as we call it, to be able to allow the light in, the space, to make it feel more like kind of that ancient Greek kind of feeling, or Roman feeling that they're trying to recreate. And so this is Michelangelo's design. And he's largely inspired by the Pantheon in Rome and trying to recreate that idea of a Greco-Roman temple, right? So it's based on that. And so this is the actual design that he comes up with. Now what happens is they actually do add a little bit to this. They add that facade, that kind of front porch there, a little bit later. So Michelangelo dies and they promise to stay true to his design, which for the most part they do. But they later come in and add a few extra, I don't know how much, feet, yards, whatever it was. And the reason for that is because it was a burial site. And so with his smaller design, rather than having the Latin cross, having the Greek cross was a smaller design. And so some of the early Christian saints that were buried there were no longer within the confines of the church. And I think people felt that was a little bit problematic, that now they feel like they're quote-unquote kicked out, and they felt that was a little sacrilegious to kick out saints who were buried there. And so they expanded a little bit to allow those saints to still be within the confines of the church. But thinking about this in terms of the Renaissance and the designs, he clearly was inspired by Brunelleschi's design, right? This idea that going back to the ancients and bringing this dome back, Michelangelo was interested in that idea. Bramante wanted it more of a kind of a flattened dome, but Michelangelo likes the idea of elongating it, very similar to what we see with Brunelleschi's, kind of a more of an oval shape, which is a tribute to Brunelleschi's design. Brunelleschi's is a little bit larger than St. Peter's in diameter. Brunelleschi's was 142 feet. Michelangelo's was 136, and so not much, just 6 feet separate them, but it's a little bit smaller. Some believe that the hemispherical dome that Michelangelo designed was later changed when they altered the facade, but I don't know. That's still a little bit up for debate. Just taking a look at the kind of continuing on with architecture, showing these ideas in Rome, but also seeing them beyond Rome's borders. We see the influence in Venice. And so here we see the ideas of the Renaissance influencing throughout Italy. Palladio was a Venetian architect. He was influenced by the principles of the Renaissance and classical designs. And he was particularly influenced by the Roman architect Vitruvius, with the ideas of the perfect circle and square. And so we'll kind of see that throughout. But this is the Giorgio Maggiore in Venice. And what we can see here is he's taking the ideas of these Greco-Roman temples that you see on the far right, and kind of bringing them back, but placing them within a Christian context. And so we see the columns, we see the facade, we see the pediment on the top, giving it that kind of feel for a kind of a temple, that you're entering into this classical kind of space, but also at the same time you're entering into a Christian space as well. So again, borrowing those ideas, and this is the inside of it. Again, you can see the open concept, the light that comes in, and it just kind of feels like this empty space where it's just kind of overwhelming with vastness, which is very similar to a Greco-Roman kind of temple. This one you can see the influence of Vitruvius perhaps the most. This is a villa rotunda, and a villa is it was supposed to be a working farm, but not necessarily a working farm for someone that is of the lower classes. This was a working farm for someone that was trying to get away from a very wealthy person, trying to get away from the city, and then they go to quote unquote the farm or the ranch, or however you want to phrase that, to be able to get away and to relax. But this perhaps is the best design that comes out of the Renaissance, that demonstrates the Neoplatonic principles that were important, the emphasis on math and the circle and the square. Here what we see here is everything is focused on symmetry, right? So there's 4 porches. It's a perfect mathematical square. And it shows the kind of getting away from the ideas of the earlier medieval style to demonstrate that the Greco-Roman principles are the ideal. And so he was extremely inspired by the Pantheon in Rome and just kind of replicates that. The difference, though, is that the Pantheon in Rome doesn't have 4 porches on each, or a porch on each side. But this one does. So he kind of takes that principle and says, I'm going to be even more mathematical and more precise and more symmetrical to give you this kind of sense. Now, this kind of also shows, just kind of backing up and placing labels on this, as art historians do, this kind of shows the messiness of art history. Is this mannerism? Is this Renaissance? And I think the answer is yes to both. In the terms of Renaissance, this shows Neoplatonism. This shows the ideas of humanism, the idea of ancient Greco-Roman ideas coming back and being re-emerging into the style. But it also shows the ideas of mannerism, kind of taking the Renaissance and adding a kind of this elaborate, ornate, kind of extreme version of the Renaissance, and we kind of see that as well. And so, is this mannerism? Is this Renaissance? I think the answer is it's a little bit tricky, right? I think you can make an argument for both of them, but what it shows is that styles don't change overnight. It's not as though there's like all of a sudden there's a decree and says the Renaissance style is dead, we're now doing mannerism. There's nothing like that. Artists just kind of change. They just kind of respond to what the patrons want, what they kind of feel as their kind of individual style. And so it's not as though styles kind of change overnight. Sometimes as we're studying art history, we kind of get that sense of, okay, this is the date. Raphael dies in 1520, therefore everyone's doing something entirely new. That's not quite the case, right? Some artists kind of maintain earlier kind of traditions or earlier styles. Some artists are more quick to change to newer styles. It just shows that it's a complex conversation happening, and not everyone's kind of on the same page at the same time, right? So this is done in 1567, 1570. So at the height of kind of mannerism happening in Rome and Florence, but we see in Venice, we can see some ideas of mannerism, but also some ideas and values of the Renaissance as well. So these ideas sometimes spread slowly. Sometimes a specific designer clings to them. Sometimes they're more advanced. It's kind of hard to say. And so, yes, it has some elements of mannerism, and yes, it has some elements of the High Renaissance.